Studios. Ladies and gentlemen, I am back for an Ace of Rays podcast episode in the off season. It is November now. The Rays have not played baseball in almost 2 months. I mean, we're kind of coming up on that. The Rays haven't played baseball in a little while. I guess coincidentally, my mental health has gotten better. We're going to talk about the Tampa Bay Rays. But first, I think we got to talk about the MLB postseason and some things that came out of it. So it was really, I got to say, I watched more of the postseason than I maybe thought I would. But it was a really good postseason, start to finish. The one thing that I really dislike now is the wild card, though. I really dislike how the wild card is run. Um, if you're gonna have a round before the division series, I think you got to stretch it out a little more, and every team should play in it. You know, so if you've got to extend it to 8 teams or whatever, that I think looks a lot better than what the wild card has come to. And let me tell you why. We spent about 2 months um, concentrating on the American League Central. You know, even if you didn't really care about the American League Central, it was, pretty big thing that was going on. There were some pretty big historic headlines coming out of that division. The Tigers collapsed twice. The second time was a lot worse than the first. Cleveland, who was awful at the beginning of the season, comes out of nowhere. And on the last day of the season, Cleveland wins a division over Detroit. Now, the problem that I have is that after that whole battle, that 2 month battle, back and forth, where if you're a Cleveland Guardians fan, you're getting your hopes up about the division, even let alone a playoff spot to begin with. They weren't even close to that for a long time this season. So you're getting all hyped up. You get it. You win the division, and you play the team that you were competing with for that division crown in the first round. And out of a 162 game season, you lose in three. Three are all that matters. 2 months of battling to get that home series, to get that home atmosphere, to even get in the playoffs and call yourselves a division champion, for it to be over in 3 days. You know, I really don't like that. Um, and some of these series, don't need to happen. I don't like the, having 8 teams in the playoffs either. I think if you're going to make the case that there should be more teams in the postseason, that maybe there should be 6, then you have to expand to 8, because I really just don't like the format as it exists now. And in the past, not this year, but in the past, the higher seeds have struggled because the way that the playoffs are set up, game one, if you're a team that got a bye, you're going out there with your ace. Game two, you're going out there with your second best pitcher. If you lose one of those games, you're in the hole. Game three, you're going on the road, and you're probably facing the other team's ace and then their second best pitcher. So if you drop any of those first 2 games at home, either of them, then good luck. And that's what happened to the Atlanta Braves. It's what's happened to the Atlanta Dodgers or Los Angeles Dodgers. It's what happened to the Philadelphia Phillies last year. It just happens kind of over and over. And that I think is just unfair to the division series teams, is that you lose one of those games and you're automatically put at a disadvantage. I think the best setup for the postseason, and nobody's going to agree with me, but I think you limit it to 4 teams, the way that it used to be. The division winners and one wild card team. And I didn't like the old way of you can't play a team in your division in the first round. I think that's, it's called the division series. So, like, okay, it should be teams in the same division, you would hope. Maybe sometimes. I do think, though, that limiting it to 4 teams is the best possible path, because let's be honest, the fifth and sixth seed, I mean, they can go on a run, sure. It's good for entertainment value, I guess, but are you really determining like a champion in that case, like when the Phillies got in 2022 and they make the run to the World Series, did anyone give them a shot against the Astros? The Arizona Diamondbacks the following year against the oh shoot, who did that? Oh, the Texas Rangers. And the Rangers, they were a 5 seed. Okay, I get it. It's good for entertainment value, but you're not really determining who the best team in Major League Baseball is. Um, so if you really want to determine, who the best team is, limit the postseason to the teams that played the best through 162 games, which is a lot. Um, and then make every round longer. Not every round, but the first round, the division series should be best of 7. You shouldn't be bad for one weekend and then your season is over. That's just the way it is because teams get hot and cold, and that's the postseason kind of shows that at times too. Not this postseason. This postseason was cut and dry from the start. The higher seed won pretty much every series. Detroit won against the Guardians, as I mentioned. That was I think the one case of the lower seed winning a series. Um, the Dodgers also beating the Phillies, although the Dodgers just seemed better than the Phillies. It's hard for me to just get through my head that the Dodgers weren't the 1 seed because they were the favorites since the start. Um, so yeah, not entirely true that the higher seed won every round, but the team that was expected to win every round, I think, won. Um, Maybe except for the Tigers, given their collapse, but I thought the Yankees had it better than the Red Sox. The Red Sox were kind of running on adrenaline after the Devers trade. I think that just kind of brought them together, and then they went on this run. Um, the Cubs win in the first round. Kind of everybody saw that coming. Dodgers smoked the Reds. And then you get into the division series, and a lot of it is cut and dry. Milwaukee, I think beating the Cubs was a good series for both teams. The Seattle Detroit series was crazy. Two teams that you really wouldn't expect to put on that good of a show. The highlight coming into this postseason was going to be Yankees versus Red Sox, and the best series was this Seattle versus Detroit series, minus I think the World Series. But even still, that 15 inning game was crazy to basically end the series, and it ends on a walk off. Um, Toronto beating the Yankees. It's pretty cool to see. I was cheering for Toronto. Not gonna lie in that series. I was cheering for the Mariners in the next round. That was another really good series, the ALCS. Another one that went to a game 7. Toronto wound up winning that one. Of course, you can't say the word game 7 in Toronto now. Between the Blue Jays in the World Series and the Toronto Maple Leafs, those words are kind of frowned upon. I think you spend the night in jail in Toronto if you say the words game 7. So it's a good thing I'm filming this from New Jersey. Um, the National League side, for the most part, was just boring. Everybody who you expected to win won. Um, and in convincing fashion. Dodgers walked all over Milwaukee in the NLCS, and that's what I guess you can expect from deferred payments. Um, I think I was just waiting for the World Series to end. Um, the entire postseason, and kind of knowing that it was going to be the Dodgers, being able to just point to the deferred payments and just the need for that to kind of stop if you want competitive balance. Um, and then Miguel Rojas, of all people, was the guy that won the Dodgers the World Series, and the pitching staff minus Yamamoto kind of crumbled. Um, and they did it without Vesia too, which is pretty crazy. Um, but yeah, Dodgers won their second straight World Series. Can't say I'm surprised. It was a good series. World Series was a good series. But I can't say I'm surprised at the outcome, or I am at least a little bit surprised of how it came about. I'll admit that. So yeah, so Dodgers won their second straight World Series. Meanwhile, the Tampa Bay Rays sat at home. They did not play in this World Series. They did not play in this postseason for the second straight year. Um, and not a lot happened during that time. There were some teams that kind of made some moves, during the during the postseason, during the World Series, even a little bit, or even just clarifying some of their moves. Talking about what their team is going to look like going forward. The Tampa Bay Rays started their moves kind of like a little bit last week. Um, there were teams that re-signed players on expiring contracts and extended options and stuff, but the Rays waited until uh, November 6th to kind of get that going. So the Rays did make a couple of moves, a couple ones that flew under the radar as well. Adrian Hauser became a free agent. That didn't really get a lot of attention. Alex Faedo as well, who, that just sucks that he didn't really get a good full season with the Rays. Manuel Rodriguez was activated from the 60-day IL, but I think this was just part of a move, from an offseason standpoint because he's going to be out for the entirety of next season. Same with Shane McClanahan, although that's still up in the air. I don't know anything about Shane McClanahan or when he's coming back or why it's going to be for another team. Um, the Rays also it was kind of a surprise to me. They selected the contract of Forrest Whitley, who was not good with the Rays. Was a little better with Durham at times. He did struggle a little bit with Durham. Um, a couple of names that I thought were a little bit of a head scratcher. Uh, Players that were designated for assignment were Cameron Meisner and Bob Seymour. Uh, Cameron Meisner was a guy who started the season, if you can remember, way back in March with a walk-off home run against the Colorado Rockies. And I don't know if a lot of people know his story from this past year, but he at the end of last season he just wasn't hitting with the Rays, and I think they hoped that start of this season would be a different story, that there'd be some sort of improvement there. And there really wasn't outside of that first game. So the Rays sent him down to Durham, and in I think his first game back in Durham, he got injured, and I think he was out for, if not the entire season, then most of the season. Um, he was a guy that the Rays were at least looking to for a long period of time because they kept him up probably longer than he should have been up. Um, and so designating him for assignment, that was a little bit of a head scratcher to me as to why, this the team that gave him the chance last year and then was willing to give him the chance at the start of this year, even though he wasn't really all that good last year. Now all of a sudden, I mean, it's sort of the same thing as Taj Bradley. They send him down, they expect him to get better, and that he's going to come back up, and then they trade him. Um, I don't know. But that's a little disappointing. I guess because it's a crowded outfield now, but you never know how long that's going to last. It's a young outfield, so I'd like to have a little bit of depth, maybe, especially in right field. Cameron Meisner could play right field. There's not a lot of depth out there for the Rays right now. Bob Seymour as well, a guy that the Rays had up for a majority of the second half of the season with Jonathan Aranda being injured. Um, I guess DFAing him was just all right. Well, we got Yandy Diaz back and Jonathan Aranda back for next season, so we're fine. Either that or there's going to be another move at some point, but um, I don't know. I guess it is what it is. But he was a player that was good. I think good down the stretch a little bit for the Rays. He did better than I think people expected. I don't think anybody even expected him to be in the majors this season, and he wound up batting 205. So I mean, you could have had a lot worse. Rays fans of 2024 know that offense was really hard to come by, and 205 was actually a good number in 2024. Um, the biggest name, I think, well, aside from the options being extended to Taylor Walls and Brandon Lau, which were expected, Maybe not so much Taylor Walls. I think there was a little bit of a question there, but you knew that the Rays were going to extend an option to Brandon Lau. Um, the big name that they didn't extend an option to was Pete Fairbanks, and this was a little controversial to some people. I actually agree with the move. Uh, Last season for the Rays, pitching wise, was not good. And a lot of that fell on the bullpen down the stretch being unable to command leads. And it seemed like the Rays would have a lead or be in a tie game down the stretch, and one of the high leverage guys, whether it's Fairbanks or Clevenger, would come in, and it was an emotional roller coaster that often ended down, is the best way to put it. And Pete Fairbanks was a big part of that. Remember, I was there, and I have the vlog on this channel being there for the Boston Red Sox walk off against the Rays. Who was it that Cedon Rafaela, I think, hit the walk off? I don't even remember. I just remember being there and watching it and filming it too, and it's on the channel. Huh, so fun. Um, and then that was part of the series. They got swept too, so they were up in that game. And then yeah, they got walked off, and that wasn't the only time, you know. And I've said this multiple times. You know, he's hasn't been solid for the Rays this past season. You know, before that, he had his moments where he was shaky, but he was mostly pretty good. But this past year, it just wasn't there. So I understand not extending the player option to him, especially when I think that the way that the Rays exist now is that their offense is ahead of their pitching in terms of a rebuild, if you want to call it that. You know, the players that the Rays are going to look to for the foreseeable future on offense are here now, basically, almost all of them. A lot of them had actually really good seasons, like Jake Mangum and Chandler Simpson, Jonathan Aranda, of all people. Coming into the season, it was really about the core four, I guess you could say, with Mangum, Simpson, Caminero, and then Carson Williams. Um, but Jonathan Aranda worked his way into that conversation. It was actually the Rays' best player for a majority of the season. And I think he would have been, if not a finalist for MVP voting, then at least in the conversation had he not gotten injured. He was having a fantastic season. And he comes back and he doesn't have a lot of time at the end of the season once he comes back, but he still performs. So you like to see that. That gives you reason for optimism heading into next year. That was just a freak type of situation. And of course it had to happen on the day of the deadline, when Jonathan Aranda got injured. It goes from bad to worse. You go from Sellers to now your best hitter is out injured for who knows how long. Wound up being about 2 months. Um, so yeah, so those are the big moves that the Rays made. The other one, Brian Van Bell, was a guy that the Rays got from Baltimore, right? Oh no, wait, this never mind. This was the minor league guy who came up for a little bit. Um, I was thinking of the Orioles guy. But yeah, those were really the big moves. So now looking towards next year, where are we at? Because at the start of this season, the big focus was going to be on the outfield and I think shortstop. A little bit at first base as to who would back up Yandy Diaz, and I almost forgot, but a lot at catcher. There was a lot of attention, I think, at catcher. Um, and so going into this offseason, what are the Rays really looking for right now? Um, where are the holes that they need to fill? I think that the the outfield is solid. They did a good job in building this outfield, and I think that with who they have up right now, it looks good. It looks good for the Rays. Jake Mangum is here. Chandler Simpson is here. They're here to stay. They're not going anywhere. People complain about the power game, but you do need people to just get on base to hit for average. The Rays' problem this past season was they couldn't get the big hit when they really needed it, Like they would have these great numbers, and I mentioned this before, they would have fantastic numbers like with runners in scoring position and stuff. And a lot of that kind of gets taken out of context because they would be great with runners in scoring position in games where they were blowing out the opponent like 12 to nothing or something like that. They'd be up 6-0 in a game and have a runner on second and get a hit and make it 7-0 or something. But in the 3-2 games, in the 2-1 games, in the 5-4 games, they weren't getting the key hits when they needed them. That was what I call the eye test. They didn't pass the eye test for a majority of the season, um, except for the games. Well, first off, between late May and late June, where they were just dominating the entire MLB, even some of the best teams in the league, like the Mets at the time. If you can believe it, the Mets were actually the best team in the MLB when the Rays played them in early June, and then the Rays swept them. So that was fun. Good times. Back when we were so innocent, we thought this team could make the playoffs and maybe even do something in them. Who knows? Um, Back when Mets fans thought that they could make the playoffs and maybe even do something in them. So, it was a weird season all around, and I did say that before as well. Teams that were first place in their division in late June, or even in a playoff spot in late June, a lot of them wound up not finishing as well as they maybe would have hoped, while teams that weren't top of their division kind of came out of nowhere, like Toronto, and basically had a great season second half and made a name for themselves in the playoffs. The Mariners were another team like that. Uh, the Cleveland Guardians were a team like that, even though they didn't win in the first round. So the Rays weren't alone in collapsing this year. That happened across the MLB, and the Rays collapse actually wasn't as bad as the Mets and the Tigers, I would argue. Um, it just didn't, the Rays don't get a lot of media attention, so it is what it is. But but this past year they did a good job at filling the holes in the outfield, I think. Last season was a struggle to get consistent hitting from the outfield. The outfield last season looked a lot different than the outfield this season. The unfortunate thing was that Johnny DeLuca couldn't be part of it for the most part. He had a great September, and I was hoping at the start of the season that that would just continue, that he'd be the guy that the Rays could look to consistently in center field with Jose Siri gone. Um, it was a really quick transition, especially after Cameron Meisner. Um, there was somebody before Cameron Meisner got well, Johnny DeLuca got injured. So it was really quick after Johnny DeLuca got injured to Chandler Simpson and Jake Mangum as everyday outfielders, joining Josh Lowe for the most part. Um, and so I think I like where the Rays outfield sits as of right now. And I hope that they continue where they were at last year, especially Mangum and Simpson. But I also think there's room for improvement, especially in right field. I don't think Josh Lowe had aside from a couple of moments, he didn't have a good season. For the second straight season, he just did not have a good season. Um, and I think that an outfield of Mangum, DeLuca, and Simpson is more appealing than Mangum, Simpson, and Lowe. Maybe Josh Lowe rebounds in 26, but we were hoping for the same thing in 25 and just didn't get it. Um, I don't know. I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that if he's not performing at a high level and the Rays aren't winning games, that he couldn't be a piece that shipped off at the deadline this year. I thought he was in the conversation last year. I really thought that the Phillies were going to get him because they needed help in right field. They needed just help in the outfield in general. And they got Harrison Bader instead, and somebody else, I forget who. But I thought that he was going to be a guy that the Rays shipped off at the deadline this year, and they didn't. But that's not to say that they couldn't next year, in 2026, especially if he's not performing up to the standards and the Rays aren't playing as well as they maybe could be. Um, the unfortunate thing is that it's also Brandon Lau's last year. He's going to be an unrestricted free agent after this year. Maybe he resigns. I hope he resigns because he's a big player for the Rays. But we'll see. Um, but yeah, Josh Lowe is a player that I'm looking to next year. In terms of the infield, I didn't think coming into this season maybe that Junior Caminero was going to play as much as he did, but he had an MVP type of season. You know, he was in the discussion. Not that he was going to beat Cal Raleigh for it, but he was a little bit in the discussion, especially down the stretch. He played 153 games, I think, or something like that, which is probably about 30 more than I expected him to play. You know, he was the everyday third baseman for the Rays. He was out there every day, pretty much. You know, and that's tough to do, especially playing the same position over and over. I mean, that doesn't really happen that much across the MLB. And he had a great season. He had 44, 45 home runs. You know, so good, and it wasn't even just that. He didn't just hit for home runs or hit for power. You know, he just hit in general. You know, his average last season 264, his OPS 846, 110 RBIs. He did have 45 home runs, so there you go. Um, but it wasn't just, you know, he wasn't a 220, 230 type hitter with 45 home runs. No, he hit doubles. He hit singles. He got the barrel to the baseball and he got on base when they needed him to get on base a lot of the time. He was almost a shining light where the Rays would be struggling in a given situation, you know, or they would desperately need something and he would come to the plate and you'd be able to feel good about it most of the time in those critical situations. Doesn't mean he always converted, but I think he converted more often, you know, than he didn't in the really critical situations where he was at the plate. Um, in terms of the other infielders, shortstop was a question coming into this year. Shortstop is still a giant question mark going into next year. Taylor Walls right now is I guess, the de facto everyday shortstop, but that could change and I think it will change ultimately. I think that as next season goes on, at least I hope Carson Williams will be the everyday shortstop at least by August, September. He didn't have the best stats this past season, but again, he had just gotten called up. But towards the end of the season, he kind of found his groove a little bit more. He wound up batting 172 this past season with 5 home runs. Two of them were on his debut, I believe. So he's a guy I think the Rays are going to look to maybe more often than they did this past year. Um, you know, even at the end of the season. I mean, he was not even really doing too well in AAA, and they kind of just call him up because they don't have any other option really. Uh, and you know, his debut was fantastic, and then everything after that was a little bit lackluster. So hopefully I kind of envision a split at shortstop between Walls and Williams this season. And we'll see who winds up winning that battle. But I hope it's Williams because I think Williams is the guy the Rays are going to look to going forward. Especially, you know, Taylor Walls, his options picked up, sure, but the Rays have been hoping for years that he'd be the guy, and he just hasn't been the guy. Hassan Kim was the guy that they brought in to fill that hole at shortstop, and he played probably 7 games. Was injured again, was injured a third time, and then was traded to Atlanta. So yeah, that was Hassan Kim. That was a story at shortstop this season. Jesus Christ. Yeah, that was fun. That's part of the reason that the Rays didn't make the playoffs is shortstop was a question mark and shortstop remained a question mark the entire season. Second base wasn't a question. Brandon Lau, he had a decent season, you know. 256 average, 31 homers. This was, I think, only the second 30 homer year in his career. Now, playing at Steinbrenner probably helped a lot with that. But at the same time, 30 home runs is nothing really to sneeze at. That's a pretty good uh, a good, big accomplishment, I think. And then just, batting 256, it's solid, maybe not where you would hope, ideally, but is what it is. First base was a hole that didn't need to be filled. It wasn't even a hole. It was there. It was Yandy Diaz's spot. I think backup first base was the real issue heading into the season. Who's going to back up Yandy Diaz when they need him to DH or something? And that answer presented itself on day one in the form of a guy that Rays fans relentlessly criticized in 2024 in Jonathan Aranda. Um, so yeah, so that was fantastic. He had a great season. Just a shame he got injured. But that is something that the Rays at least can be optimistic about. They've got two really good first basemen, between Aranda and Yandy Diaz. And then at DH, Yandy Diaz kind of is a de facto DH, and Jonathan Aranda as well. Christopher Morel occasionally, but I don't know about that. We'll see. We'll see if that continues this year. And then catcher. Catcher was the big one. Catcher was a question mark coming into the season, and they got Danny Jansen, and he was good, and the Rays weren't, and so they traded Danny Jansen, and so they basically cycled through catchers throughout the season. There might have been maybe like five or six players that caught games for the Tampa Bay Rays this season. I don't even remember who the other one was, But they brought in Nick Fortes from Miami. They brought in Hunter Fiducia from the Dodgers, and they were, I guess, a little better than last year. But then again, you can't have gotten much worse than last year at catcher. That was just a terrible position for them, between Ben Rortvedt and Alex Jackson. But I don't know. They're young guys. Maybe, I mean, the Rays are high on Fiducia. I would have hoped that Fiducia would have had a home run or something this season at the very least. Like Fiducia was a guy that they brought in, you know, with the OKC Dodgers. He was a guy that hit home runs. He didn't hit for average. He was a power hitter. And with the Rays, he didn't really hit anything. He batted 148 and didn't have any home runs, which is not, I think, what the Rays were looking for in 88 games this season. Not what they were looking for. So catcher is a question mark this season. Bullpen is going to be another question this offseason, and I'm not going to go through every name, but the bullpen struggled down the stretch, and they're not getting Manuel Rodriguez back for a little while. Um, Maybe even until 2027. I don't know. There's talk he could be back in September or October. I just don't know. I don't think anybody does. Um, I hope Eric Orzi is up more often than he was last year because he was good for the Rays, and he got sent down because I don't even remember who. Somebody was coming back up, and so Eric Orzi was a guy that was great with the Rays when he was up, but spent most of the season in the minors and was great down there, but that doesn't help the first team. Um, Mason Englert, I think, made strides. Brian Baker, the guy they brought in from Baltimore and pitched, as soon as he got off the plane, and didn't look good, never looked good, but he's back. Garrett Clevenger, who knows? Griffin Jacks, that was a nightmare. Griffin Jacks, oh my God. The guy that they brought in to close when Pete Fairbanks wasn't available, who could never close, who could not close a single game. I mean, the guy blew every lead that the Rays had in a closed type situation. It's that was too much for me. Like seeing Griffin Jacks come in a closed type of situation, especially late in the season when you knew his numbers, that was awful. So the bullpen is a question mark. The bullpen, which was not a question mark really at the end of last season. A whole pitching staff that wasn't a question mark at all at the end of last season. And I still think that if I was a Rays upper management person, I'd be kicking myself over giving up Jeffrey Springs over Shane Baz. You know, anybody who watched the Rays in 2024 could see that Jeffrey Springs was the guy. You know, Shane Baz could not find location at times in 24 when he came off the IL. So that's your guy, you know? That's the guy you trade to the Oakland Athletics, not Jeffrey Springs. Jeffrey Springs was good for the Rays last year. And he wasn't half bad with the Athletics either, I don't think. And I think he probably would have been better if he had stayed with the Rays. But that's the guy that man, that sucks. That sucks that they gave him up and they kept Shane Baz. Shane Baz finished the season with an ERA of 4.87 and 166 innings pitched and 176 strikeouts. Not just not good. Even for a fifth guy in the rotation, like that's fine if you want to be middle of the pack, but if you want to win, if you want to make the playoffs, you got to have better than that. I mean, come on. Um, the rest of the rotation struggled a lot throughout the year. They all got hot at the same time in late May, mid-May through the end of June, basically, or at least until they got trounced by the Baltimore Orioles. I think it was like 22-8. Um, and so at the deadline, they wound up trading Zach Littell, who was one of their best. They traded him to the Cincinnati Reds. And they traded Taj Bradley, who was one of their worst. And they sent him down to the minors to figure some things out. And they said, "Oh, he'll be back," until he very much wasn't. He was traded for Griffin Jacks, and that wound up not working out for the Rays. I mean, there's still time, I guess, for that move to work out, but I'm not too optimistic about that. That strikes me as a pretty bad move. And we'll see how that goes in the long run, but that was not a good move. Ryan Pepio was another guy who struggled throughout the year, but he ate up innings. He seemed to have like one good outing and one bad outing a lot of the time. So hopefully we get a little more consistency in 2026. And then Ian Seymour came into the rotation, who he was a bullpen guy for the first half of the season, and then he came into the rotation, and he was pretty solid, for the most part. I mean, he had a few games where, maybe he wasn't a really fantastic pitcher. He gave up a lot of runs occasionally as a starter. But his numbers as a starter were actually better than as a reliever. He had a 3.16 ERA as a starter, 4.02 as a reliever. His ERA for the season was 3.63. It's not bad, And he was a guy I thought the Rays should have had in the rotation when the rotation was struggling. And ultimately, he gets put in the rotation late in the year. I think that maybe it might help to have him in some sort of opener situation at times as well, but only if he's struggling as an everyday starter. I think when Kevin Cash went to the opener strategy this season, it was ill-advised because it was after a pitcher had made a really good start that they would put him in that sort of bulk reliever role, and it didn't work out very well. There were a lot of bad decisions throughout the year. Um, but I think the starting rotation is, I didn't even mention Drew Rasmussen, who had a fantastic year for the Rays. There's nothing bad you can say about that. Hopefully, he can continue that and then even pitch a few more innings in 2026. But I think the rotation is a little bit of a question mark as well. Maybe you add another pitcher there. I think that the bullpen is the bigger issue, especially because the bullpen is getting older now, and Pete Fairbanks not being there, they're going to need to fill that hole with somebody else, whether it's Eric Orzi or outside free agent. I have no idea. I'm not going to get into potential free agents the Rays should pick up, but I will end on this. The Rays, their question marks coming into 25 are pretty similar to the question marks entering 2026. Shortstop, catcher, um, a little bit of outfield, but just in terms of right field, in my opinion. And then there are a couple of other ones that weren't there in 24, like the bullpen and the starting pitching staff. So we'll see. we'll see what the Rays do this offseason. But I am hoping that the Rays will be aggressive in free agency. With again, it's Brandon Lau's last year on his contract. You don't know if he's going to re-sign. Yandy Diaz, who's 34 now, his last year is in 2027. So if you want to win with this core, you got to kind of start now. 26 should be the year they make the postseason. Um, if for nothing else than to get the core five as they are now: Chandler Simpson, Carson Williams, Junior Caminero, Jonathan Aranda, and Jake Mangum, to get them the experience of playing in a postseason atmosphere. I think that has to be this year. Um, we know they're not going to win the World Series this year in 2026. We just hope for forward progress, and a lot of that depends on who they get in free agency, um, which we'll see. And I'll probably wind up making an episode at some point once the ball gets rolling then. But it'll be a very critical offseason for the Tampa Bay Rays, and we'll see very early whether the ownership group will take the same strategy, which was cheap as the old ownership, or whether they will finally go out and get those free agents. Like the Rays are not going to be all in on a Juan Soto type of player like last year. I don't think anybody expected Juan Soto to be a Tampa Bay Ray. Um, but maybe some of the middle of the pack kind of names, the guys that could give the Rays a little bit of a boost. You hope anyway. You never know. But that's what I think at least I hope for out of general management, and with the new ownership group that they'll be more willing to spend money. But anyways, that is going to be it for this video. Thank you guys very much for watching, and let's hope we get some moves, please, soon. Peace out, broskies.